Hi, I'm Walter Koenig. Before you watch the episodes on this Volume 3.1 of Star Trek episodes, I'd like to share with you some background information and memories about filming them. Following NBC's promise to renew our program for a third season, Gene Roddenberry was assured a very favorable time slot, Monday nights at 7:30. At the end of Season 2, John Meredith Lucas had stepped down from the role of producer. Gene resolved to step back into the breach to become the producer in charge of day-to-day production, determined that Season 3 was going to be our best season yet. He began commissioning scripts, instructing writers to bring personalities to the fore, increase Kirk's confidence, play on the Spock-McCoy bickering. With 8 scripts in hand, Gene flew to Palm Springs to begin working them up into final drafts. The phone rang to inform him that NBC had reneged on their promise and switched Star Trek to Friday nights at 10 p.m., completely the wrong audience. From that point, Gene lost a lot of his enthusiasm for the show. He had often worked throughout the night, rewriting, sleeping briefly on his office couch before starting the next day. He was not prepared to do that again for a poor viewing slot. So he retreated to executive producer again. He was replaced as producer by Fred Freiberger. The third season started quite well for me. Spectre of the Gun is one of my 4 favorite stories. Chekhov gets to have a romance, carry a 6-shooter, and he even dies. I love the sparse, surrealistic way in which this episode was shot. I thought it had a tremendous feeling of atmosphere. More than any other show we did, this one had a very distinctive style. I did have one problem, though, and that was with the script's logic, and I brought it to the attention of the story editor. He told me that the writing staff had had the same concern, but couldn't seem to find a way around the difficulty, and so had decided to ignore it. To wit, once the Enterprise crew understood that the shootout was only an illusion, they could no longer be harmed by the guns of the Clanton gang. So Chekhov had died because he was shot before this information was revealed. It is not really explained how Chekhov came to be back on the bridge alive and thriving at the end of the episode. Perhaps my resurrection had something to do with the fact that I had been signed to a contract as a series regular for this season. John Meredith Lucas wrote and directed our next episode, Elan of Troyes. He claims it was based on an existing story by Gene Roddenberry, in turn a genre remake of Taming of the Shrew. During the filming of this episode, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Our guest star, France Nguyen, was a civil rights activist and had been very supportive of Kennedy's presidential campaign. Perhaps one of the reasons why Star Trek ultimately became so popular was that in this climate of violence and political storm, civil rights and warfare, Star Trek spoke of a future when mankind had largely overcome these problems. Fred Freiberger was told that one of the reasons why Star Trek's ratings were low was because the show did not appeal to women. They were frightened by the concepts and needed more familiar frames of reference. When writer Margaret Arman turned in The Paradise Syndrome, she got the distinct impression that Fred did not like the script, but was railroaded into its production by Gene Roddenberry. In any event, this script was one episode which enthused the network executives, especially after several of their wives commented favorably. Welcome to Volume 3.2 of Star Trek. I'm Walter Koenig, and I'd like to share some memories of the episodes you're about to watch. On the previous cassette, I told you about the backstage machinations which occurred during our preparation for Star Trek's third season. I can remember quite clearly where I was when I heard that instead of our prime-time Monday night slot, we were being shifted into the Friday night graveyard hour. I was with George Takei and Jimmy Doohan on horseback, doing publicity photographs. I remember hearing about the switch and feeling like I had been hit by a thunderbolt. I had been looking forward to the third season very much. The network had requested my presence be developed more because my character was attracting the kind of young audience they were looking for to bolster our ratings. Gene had showed me a number of written documents indicating that my character was to be expanded considerably. In fact, I was contracted to the show rather than simply appearing on the freelance basis of Season 2. When I heard of our switch to Friday nights, I realized 2 things. 1, the show was virtually doomed to be canceled, and 2, my character would no longer be developed in the way I had hoped. The younger audience I was supposed to attract would either be in bed by 10 o'clock or out on dates. It was with a terrible sinking feeling that I finished that photo shoot. Star Trek's best stories were often the ones which came from the contemporary issues which were making the news at the time. Dorothy Fontana took her inspiration for the Enterprise incident from the capture of the intelligence ship USS Pueblo by the North Koreans in January 1968. It set her thinking about what would happen if the USS Enterprise were caught spying against the Romulans. Dorothy had begun Season 3 as story editor, but left shortly after Gene Roddenberry announced his departure from the producer's chair. Dorothy's script was rewritten by the new story editor, Arthur Singer, who added Spock's love scene. Dorothy detested this scene so vehemently that she sent a memo to Leonard Nimoy assuring him that she was not responsible. Our next show was called And the Children Shall Lead. I feel that this show was an attempt to repeat the success of the first season's child-driven story, Miri. The producers were still searching for a way to boost the show's rating and came up with a bold idea to bring in a personality who, although not an actor, was well known in his own field. Noted attorney Melvin Belli had been originally contacted by the production team to use his young son Caesar as one of the children. Eventually, Melvin was asked to play the part of the villain. He immediately and enthusiastically accepted. However, my personal opinion was that casting a lawyer rather than an actor was not the best of decisions. Despite the acknowledged histrionics of the courtroom, the players there are not necessarily thespians. In fact, Fred Freiberger later commented that the decision did not achieve its intentions and the ratings remained pretty low. Our final episode on this tape is one which was written by Gene L. Kuhn on a freelance basis. He made no secret of the desire to introduce comedy into Star Trek, and indeed his first draft of Spock's Brain was written as a comedy. Somewhere in the melee of rewriting, the episode's comedy was removed, and what was left was a rather weak, if not ludicrous, premise that Spock had his brain stolen, but his hair remains perfectly coiffured. Hi, I'm Walter Koenig, and I'd like to welcome you to Volume 3.3 of Star Trek. The first episode of this volume is titled, Is There in Truth No Beauty? By Jean Lisette Arroest, who was a writer new to television. This episode teamed actress Diana Muldaur with director Ralph Sinensky again. Ralph distinctly remembers that while casting this show, the actress they really wanted for the part became unavailable. He suggested Diana because he knew what a good actress she was and how hard she had worked on the previous season's episode. The producers were rather resistant to the idea, however, because they were trying not to use guest stars twice. Remembering that in Return to Tomorrow, Diana had appeared with her natural brunette hair, Ralph ventured the idea that perhaps she could wear a black wig to prevent the audience recognizing her. Reluctantly, the producers agreed to this, and Diana was cast. After the first day's filming, the scenes were reviewed, and Ralph remembers that Diana shone from the screen. As Bob Justman left the screening room, he mused, out loud, "I wonder how she's going to look in a red wig." He was obviously intending to employ her talents again, if we ever got to a fourth season. Way back in 1969, the BBC television network bought the rights to show Star Trek. It began its television run in England during July, when it was used to replace the highly popular British science fiction show Doctor Who. Our next episode is one, however, that has never been shown in England on terrestrial television channels. Although shown on cable and satellite television and available on video, The Empath has never been shown by BBC television. When the BBC showed the first season episode Miri, they received a number of complaints from parents who felt that the show was not suitable for children. Because Star Trek dealt with adult themes and situations, the BBC felt bound to screen episodes for their suitability. Many episodes were cut, and 3 were banned from transmission altogether: The Empath, Plato's Stepchildren, and Whom Gods Destroy. The BBC also excluded Miri from repeat transmission. These 30th anniversary releases are, of course, the complete and unedited versions of the show. Third season restrictions forced Fred Freiberger to make some interesting creative decisions. A large proportion of the set for The Empath is simply lit like a theater production, with minimal scenery picked out by spotlights. Our next episode is The Tholian Web. a visually attractive episode with its spacesuits and intricate special effects. It was written by another television first-timer, Judy Burns. She yearned to write for Star Trek in order to earn enough money to go to Africa and study. The show had so captured her imagination that she threw herself into the endeavor. Her first script, entitled A Time to Be Alive, dealt with the Enterprise's crew members stumbling across a living, interactive museum constructed by an alien race. When that was rejected, she began working on a script entitled In Essence, Nothing. She was taking lessons by this time and wanted to write a ghost story set aboard the Enterprise. The Star Trek Writer's Guide was very firm that all stories had to be rooted in science and fact. If her story was ever going to work, she had to find a justification for turning one of the regulars into an ephemeral character. Discussing the notion with a student physicist friend, he suggested using the theory of infinite dimensions, something Star Trek had used before. So instead of having her chosen character, Kirk, stuck between here and the afterlife, he became trapped between here and a parallel dimension.
Hi, I'm James Doohan, and I'm here to introduce the episodes on Volume 3.4 of Star Trek's 30th anniversary releases. Our first episode is titled, For the World is Hollow and I Have Touched the Sky. It's a story in which Dr. McCoy finally gets a chance to fall in love. Although DeForest Kelley has said that he felt there was never a show which really showcased his character, he does mention this one very favorably. It was written by Rick Volaris and directed by Tony Leader. Tony has a place in science fiction history for being the man who directed the first ever episode of Irwin Allen's science fiction series, Lost in Space. In many ways, Lost in Space was perceived as Star Trek's biggest rival while we were being produced. In fact, Network CBS, who owned it, had originally refused Star Trek, not wanting a second science fiction program. Some of those who worked on our show, like John Meredith Lucas, felt that NBC were constantly pushing for Star Trek to become more like Lost in Space, with monsters of the week and cartoon-like storylines. Our next show brought the welcome return of the Klingons. The part was originally written so that John Colicos could reprise his role as Kor from the first season's story, Errand of Mercy. The script was duly offered to Colicos, but much to the actor's disappointment, he could not make the shoot because of a feature film commitment in Italy. He remembers reading the part in his Italian hotel room and feeling a rising frustration because of the realization that he was going to have to turn the part down. Undeterred, the producers cast Michael and Sarah, and the role was renamed Kang. The storyline for this script was another which sprang out of the Vietnam situation. This time, writer Jerome Bixby wanted to reflect the power of the peace movement in America. He therefore pitched Klingons and humans into a never-ending battle, which was being orchestrated by a malevolent alien entity. In order to halt the creature's influence, the warring factions had to make peace. At the climax of this script, he had originally wanted to have the characters mount a peace rally on board the starship, but was persuaded that the script made its point without going that far. Plato's Stepchildren has become enshrined in television history for being the first program to show an interracial kiss. This occurs between Kirk and Uhura, who are under the control of powerful telekinetic beings. Much has been said about this in the past, and it is now hard to separate fact from fiction. As the script was being prepared, NBC did indeed have some concerns, but in the surviving memo from the NBC censor Gene Messerschmidt, it is clearly stated that there must be no racial overtones to Kirk and Uhura's dilemma. In other words, their reluctance at kissing one another could have nothing to do with their different skin colors, but only with their mutual respect as fellow officers. The main concern was the implication of voyeurism by the aliens, the Platonians. On the day of filming, Nichelle remembers that problems did erupt. She was asked to a meeting in the production office where network officials were panicking over whether or not some southern states would carry the show if it contained such a kiss. At one point, they even discussed whether or not they should substitute Spock for Kirk, figuring that it would be less offensive to viewers if an alien rather than a white man kissed the black girl. Finally, as a compromise, the scene was filmed in such a way that the audience did not see any physical contact between Kirk and Uhura's lips. It became an implied kiss, forced upon these two people and totally devoid of passion. When the story was finally aired, viewer reaction was quite mild, except one woman who wrote in the American magazine TV Guide that Star Trek had finally gone too far. For undisclosed reasons, the BBC decided to ban this episode from transmission in Britain, deeming it unsuitable.
Hi, I'm George Takei. I'm here to welcome you to Volume 3.5 of our Star Trek 30th Anniversary releases. Before you watch the episodes, I would like to share some of my memories about filming them. By the third year, Desilu had been taken over by the Gulf and Western Corporation, who also owned the big Hollywood studio Paramount. Under the auspices of Paramount Pictures, both our budget and the shooting schedule became tighter than ever. Another $10,000 was slashed from our episodic expenditures, so we could afford very little overtime. We were due to finish filming at 6 p.m. every evening. Overtime was paid in 6-minute intervals, and we had often stopped at 6:18 p.m. The plug would now have to be pulled at 6:12 every night. Had we been under this regime during our first season, Spock's famous scene in The Naked Time would never have been filmed. It had been achieved in one take between 6:12 and 6:18 p.m. The shooting schedule was now deemed so unbreakable that one director was fired when perceived to be going over deadline, despite the fact that he had 3 days left. The first episode on this volume is entitled Wink of an Eye. The crew of the Enterprise encounter a mystery when they beam down to an inhabited planet but can find no trace of the people who live there. It was a debut script by Arthur Heinemann, who would contribute a total of 3 scripts to the later half of our third season. Arthur remembers that the director of this episode, Judd Taylor, took great care to capture the writer's vision on camera. They would have conversations in which they would discuss the various characters' thoughts and motivations for doing what they were doing. During our second season, I had taken a leave to make a film which overran because of bad weather, and I had lost a lot of Sulu's best shows to Chekhov. I was rather jealous of Walter Koenig, especially over one called The Gamesters of Triskelion. With this next episode, That Which Survives, Walter paid back the favor. He requested some time off to go to New York to appear in a comedy, Make a Million, with Jackie Coogan. So while Walter was off, this episode was rewritten for Sulu. They even slipped in a line for Kirk, which says, "If I had wanted a Russian history lesson, I would have brought Chekhov along." We were joined on this episode by former Miss America Lee Meriwether, who had sprung to the attention of science fiction fans as Dr. Anne McGregor in Irwin Allen's show, The Time Tunnel. Look closely at her costume in this episode, and you will see a conspicuous piece of material which covers her navel. This was because to show that part of a woman's body on 60s television was taboo. Closing out this volume of Star Trek is the episode Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. The story was supplied by Gene Kuhn using the pseudonym Lee Cronin and worked into a script by Oliver Crawford. It dealt with racism directly. There was so much concern about civil rights and the way blacks were treated by some whites that this episode presented a race of people who were pigmented black on one side of their face, white on the other. Ludicrously, the two individuals in the story hate each other because they happen to be white on opposite sides. Oliver Crawford says that he wanted to hammer home the point that color is only skin deep. It is a show of which producer Fred Freiberger is very proud.
Hi, I'm James Doohan, and I would like to welcome you to Volume 3.6 of Star Trek episodes in our 30th anniversary releases. When Star Trek began, the producers of the show didn't really feel that the engineer would be that important as a character. Scotty was given a station on the bridge from which he could control the engines. It wasn't until the 5th episode that we first saw the engineering section. It was a very small set in those days and was built to give the impression of being much larger. Once built, the writers used it more and more often. The Enterprise became as big a character as the people aboard her. She would get into trouble week after week, and it became great fun for the writers to depict Scotty working feverishly in his engine room, leaned on by Kirk to work even faster. It was during these times that Scotty developed his best-loved lines, such as, "I cannot change the laws of physics, and the engines cannot take it." With each passing year, more money was spent to extend the engineering set, creating different levels and rooms. In our first episode on this volume, we had some notable guest stars. Whom Gods Destroy features Steve Inett. Gene Roddenberry admired the actor and had used him in the pilot Police Story, produced at the same time as the second Star Trek pilot. Yvonne Craig, who appears here as the ill-fated Orion slave girl Marta, was also an excellent dancer. She had been considered for the role of Vina in the first Star Trek pilot, The Cage. She must have been destined to appear in green body makeup because had she been Vina, she would also have had a scene as an Orion slave girl. It was during this episode that Leonard Nimoy finally became so dissatisfied with the way his character was being written that he memoed Gene Roddenberry about it and copied it to both our producer, Fred Freiberg, and the head of the studio, Doug Kramer. Leonard felt that this episode was really more than a remake of our first season episode, Dagger of the Mind. He also objected to the way in which Spock could not work out which was the duplicate Kirk. Leonard was not the only one who noticed that changes were taking place within the characterizations. Walter Koenig also noticed a radical shift in the way his character was being written, as he will tell you on the next volume. Our next show was called The Mark of Gideon. Gene Roddenberry would always tell his writers that they should pick a subject which they felt passionately about and write a story based upon that. George F. Slavin enjoyed writing what were called issue stories, and so found himself right at home on Star Trek. The theme he chose to explore in this episode was the question of overpopulation. The script was co-written by Stanley Adams, who, the season before, had guest starred in the episode The Trouble with Tribbles as Cyrano Jones. The Lights of Zatar was written by one of the world's most famous puppeteers. Together with her puppet Lamb Chop, Shari Lewis had entertained millions of people around the world. She and her husband, Jeremy Tarcher, invented this story simply because they enjoyed the show so much. When they pitched the story to Fred Freiberger, he rejected it, first time around, because a similar idea was already being worked on. He asked them to develop a second script which would inject some comedy into the show. When she returned to pitch that one, Freiberger informed her that he wanted to buy her first story after all, because the similar storyline had not worked out. She says she chose to feature my character because Kirk always romanced the ladies and she felt it was Scotty's turn.
Hi, I'm Walter Koenig, and I would like to welcome you to the penultimate volume of Star Trek episodes being released to celebrate our show's 30th anniversary. The Cloudminders was one of those proverbial stories which simply did not want to work. It finally took 3 writers to shepherd this show onto the screen. David Gerrold, who had supplied our second season episode, The Trouble with Tribbles, had written the first draft. It was then turned over to Oliver Crawford, who had handled the racism story, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. He tightened the script and narrowed the focus, but it was still not quite what the producers wanted. It was eventually handed over to Margaret Arman, who produced the final version of the script. This time, Star Trek tackled civil rights and class distinction in an effective and entertaining way. The episode featured a strata of the population living as artisans and scholars at the expense of those deemed too lowly to share in this luxury. There's a very interesting story behind the genesis of our next episode, The Way to Eden. It was originally called Joanna and would have been written by Dorothy Fontana. Every television show has what's called its Bible, a printed document used by the show's writers and directors. It sets out the format of the show and gives background information on each of the characters. During the time Dorothy Fontana worked on the show, she contributed to our Bible, in particular, generating material on Dr. McCoy. Dorothy's version of the story intended to illuminate McCoy's reasons for being in Starfleet, telling us that he joined following his marriage breakup. Her idea was that McCoy's daughter, Joanna, would come aboard the Enterprise, 20 years old and idealistic. She and her friends were searching for a paradisical place to live. The conflict in the story would have been a mutual attraction between Joanna and Kirk, forcing McCoy to view Kirk in a completely new light. Although Fred Freiberger liked the idea, his vision of McCoy was that he was the same age as Kirk, so too young to have a 20-year-old daughter. He asked Dorothy if she could write around the same premise, but replace McCoy's daughter with Chekhov's former girlfriend. Dorothy tried the modification, but she could not make it work. In the end, the script assignment was given to Arthur Heinemann. Although Chekhov was given a lot of screen time in the show, upon reflection, I think this was the lowest point for me during the entire series. As I read the script, I noticed that Chekhov had suddenly become a really inflexible, establishment-loving conservative. I mean, this was supposed to be a character drawn conscientiously as an identifiable approximation of the young people of 1969. The final episode on this volume is Requiem for Methuselah, which was written by Jerome Bixby. The script sprang from the writer's fascination with immortality. He had always wanted to write about a Cro-Magnon man who had achieved eternal life so that he could explore what that character had seen and done. This episode was praised by the editor of science fiction magazine, Analog, for being a return to the science fiction ideals which had helped make Star Trek initially popular.
Hi, I'm James Doohan. I'd like to welcome you to Volume 3.8 of Star Trek, the final cassette in our 30th anniversary releases. The Savage Curtain was Gene Roddenberry's final script writing endeavor for our show. He was working on another project at MGM and so could contribute very little. He had written the first 2 acts of a script for The Savage Curtain. It was handed over to Arthur Heinemann, who supplied the final 2 acts, rewriting the first 2 slightly to tie the show together. The script stated that Commander Scott was in full dress uniform, and so I suggested that he be dressed in tartan. Everyone thought it was a wonderful idea, and so they sent away to Scotland to find the correct Scott tartan. Once identified, they had it flown out so that the dress uniform could be made. It was a shame we never had a chance to use it again. But all our yesterdays showcased the character of Mr. Spock. The writers found a way for him to fall in love again. This time, the object of his desire was the exile Zarabeth, played by Mariette Hartley. Years later, she confessed that having so much leg on show in her revealing costume had made her feel rather strange. She was more used in playing plain sisters or doctors. Our final episode, Turnabout Intruder, was scripted by our story consultant, Arthur Singer, from an existing story by Gene Roddenberry. In the show, Kirk's mind is switched into the body of a jealous former lover. As the episode progresses, Bill Shatner's acting became more and more frenzied. When you watch the show, the perspiration on his brow is real, not just good makeup. Poor Bill was sweating his way through a fever. We finished production on the 9th of January, 1969. Turnabout Intruder was first screened on June 3rd, 1969. Star Trek's 3rd season is different in style from the preceding 2, and it is often said that we floundered throughout our third year. Despite this, the season remained true to our guiding principles of commenting upon social issues, and we produced some of our best explorations of racism and civil rights. Regardless of our efforts, however, the ratings for this season were dreadful, and we were doomed. When Star Trek disappeared from the networks and found its way to cable television, the climate changed. Over the course of several years, popularity in our show began to rise. Was it that we were before our time? Was it that NBC simply did not give us the exposure we needed? In reality, it was probably a little of both. As Star Trek gained popular support, so our fans demanded more. Finally, in 1973, our whole cast gathered together again to supply the voices for 22 episodes of an animated series of the show, which ran for 2 years. We very nearly made a brand new series known as Star Trek Phase 2 in the mid-70s, but were halted a week before production began. Paramount decided that instead of a new series, they wanted a motion picture. We made 6 in total, and Walter, Bill, and myself even got to guest star in the first Star Trek The Next Generation movie, to send our second incarnation on their way. The fact that Star Trek is the phenomenon it is today is thanks to the dedication of you, the fans. It is your continued support which has kept our show alive. To you, we dedicate these releases. May you all live long and prosper and help to bring about the Star Trek vision of a totally equal society.